The shuttle's engines rumbled as the group was on their way back to the city. James silently sat in his seat with a stoic look on his face, quietly working away at his phone, already in the process of reporting this new development to the people organising his current campaign. She'd lay on her back next to him, putting her legs across his lap while she looked up at the ceiling with her hands flatly pushed onto her eyes. Every now and then, she slightly groaned whenever a bit of turbulence would shake the shuttle slightly stronger than usual, her ears twitching in annoyance at the disturbance. James seemed to be too engrossed in his work to notice. However, after a while it seemed that the rest of their company was starting to take issue with her constant expressions of discomfort, although it was unclear if that was out of empathy or out of sheer annoyance at her incessant vocalizations. "Everything okay with you?" Sam asked, leaning her face over Sheeta's for a second, although Sheeta could only guess her movements based on what she heard, since she was still covering her eyes. "Not really, but there's nothing to be done about it," Sheeta replied. Ever since the stress of their encounter in the frigid south had died down, and especially after she had to rescue James from a desperate search for attention, after he had gotten a bit too chummy with one of the brats in the man's office, the Bane had started to act up again, this time with a vengeance. She had already taken another dose of the remedy helping with the symptoms, but in times like these, when it got especially bad, even that was only enough to ease its effects instead of fully suppressing them. "When it comes to my people, at some point our body just decides for itself that it would like to have a baby now, please, and you don't get to have a choice in the matter. And when the time comes, you either have to live with it, or you'll have to get yourself sterilized." She finally pulled one of her hands away from her eyes so she could glance up at Sam, immediately squinting as the artificial light from above her painfully stung in her darkness-filled eyes. "And while I don't plan to ever subject myself to the cosmic punishment that is pregnancy," she added, as soon as she wasn't wincing from the mild bit of pain anymore, "I'm still not that desperate quite yet, so I'll just have to endure the occasional spell of wild desire once a year." She noticed that both Sam and Andrej briefly glanced over at James, who still seemed to be too concentrated on his written conversation to notice, after she had said that. "So, you don't want children at all?" Andrej then spoke up, after his glance at James had been ignored, as he apparently tried to make small talk to the best of his ability, despite the slight awkwardness of the topic. "Why not?" Sam then chimed in, throwing an almost challenging look back at her superior, her cold blue eyes piercing the air sternly. "That's her business." As the two humans held a moment of slightly tension-filled eye contact, Sheeta now also briefly glanced up at James, and she had the feeling that she suddenly knew what this was about. "I'm not against children," she clarified, putting her hand on her stomach as her womanly parts seemed to jump in jubilation as she admitted that much, as if they had heard her say it. However, they would have to calm down since that was not what she had meant. "I just don't want to have to carry them." She paused for a second to fight back a number of unfortunate instinctual urges, which she wouldn't have followed even if she wanted to, especially in front of everyone like this. "Which is pretty handy since this one," she then said, and briefly lifted her foot to push against James's side with it, to uselessly indicate who she was obviously talking about, "couldn't get me pregnant even if you wanted to. So, it's a win-win situation." The direct physical disruption to his concentration had also been enough to pull James out of his focus for a moment, and he looked around with a look of confusion on his face, as he had clearly zoned out to such a degree that he now had no idea what the conversation had been about, and in what way it had necessitated kicking him in the process. "What?" he asked befuddled, and scanned their faces one after the other for any explanation of what he had missed while not paying attention. "It's nothing," Sam immediately assured him with a calmingly waving hand. "Don't mind us, just focus on your work, Buzz." Sheeta wasn't sure if it was purely out of spite, or if it was actually done at this point, but James looked back at the blonde woman with an incredulous expression, and with a sigh, he let the mechanical hand holding his phone sink down, stowing the device away into his pocket. "Well, our analysts have been hard at work for the last hour or so," he explained himself with a shrug, before leaning back in his seat and allowing his hands to sink down onto Cheetah's shins, which gave her instinctually charged body another reason to briefly celebrate in a hormonal wave. "But I still don't expect them to come up with anything concrete before tomorrow at least, especially since they have to contact half the planet in the meantime. At least they said they'd have a bare direction ready for me relatively soon, so I can't leave further details to them afterwards." Well, that much made sense. Not like possibly future-shaping social-political decisions could just be made on a whim. However, that left another question. A question that was soon asked by Andrej, as the long-haired major perked up at James's words, turning his crimson eyes towards his former trainee curiously. Wait, then what have you been doing for the past hour? He asked, as it hadn't seemed like James had just been zoning out for no reason previously. Sheila also looked up at him interestedly, turning her ears in James's direction to indicate that she was attentively listening as well. James shrugged and cleared his throat. I was trying to find out what kind of deals HFY has and with whom, he explained casually, with a fluid wave of his robotic arm. Since we heard about them a bunch of times now, and if they really shape Dunamir's economy in a major way, I thought that they might be well known. Had to concentrate on reading because the text translation is still a bit wonky, and most articles are written in local languages. Also, I had to reconfirm some stuff with experts back on Earth and Admir, just to make sure I understood everything. And do you care to enlighten us? Sam then asked, while the Major only lifted his eyebrows in seemingly both genuine surprise and appreciation for James looking into this stuff of his own accord. James took a deep breath and shifted his lips, while sitting up slightly by straightening his back. Well, there's no official deals I can find, but I think that's the point, he said after a moment of contemplation. There seem to be almost no existing trade deals between Dunamir and the rest of the community. Admittedly, I didn't really pay attention to that at first, since they're Deathworlders and all, but now that I think about it, well, call me paranoid, but I think that's suspicious. Especially since out of the few deals that do exist, not a single is of agricultural or culinary nature. Comestible-wise, Dunamir is currently entirely self-sustaining, a fact that some people seem to be concerningly proud of. Sam seemed to be scrupulous at James's suspicions, or at least she pretended to be. In fact, her expression was so needlessly incredulous that she'd got the suspicion that she was putting on a facade in order to coax more information out of James without having to ask nicely for it. Maybe it was also just part of this weird relation those two had going on that Sheila couldn't get behind even if she tried. Big deal, the blonde captain claimed boisterously, and leaned back in her seat, inadvertently pushing out her chest in the process. So is Earth, isn't it? The look of depreciation on James's face as he pursed his lips and rolled his eyes informed Sheila that her assertion had apparently not only been correct, but that James was seeing right through Sam's facade as well. Thus, he didn't really sound defensive in any way as he calmly explained, Not quite. Earth can be entirely self-sustaining, and we currently are since the trade routes are shut down. But before that, we imported plenty of off-world foodstuff, if only out of luxury, and we weren't nearly as strapped for food as Dunamir appears to be in places. Sam furrowed her brows, apparently thinking about that information for a second, while keeping up her skepticism act. Meanwhile, Andres leaned forward, putting his elbows onto his thighs as his long hair flowed down the side of his head. Based on your tone, I'm guessing you have some theories? He asked interestedly, his eyebrows ever so slightly raised as he studied James's face. James pushed out a long, loud breath of reservedness through hollow cheeks, clearly hesitant to fully reply to that question. I'm no expert in stuff like this, he immediately clarified, clearly in order to cover his bases for the case that whatever he was about to say would sound utterly stupid. But I at least have a theory of how HFY got its monopoly running. Sheila's ears flicked. Well, let's hear it, she said, slightly lifting her head for a moment to look at her boyfriend more directly. Seeing him use his big head was always quite enticing. Also, hearing him talk about dry business matters might dissuade a quite annoying body from lusting over him for some time. 'Cause usually there are precautions in place to prevent stuff like this, so I'm interested to hear what happened there. Admittedly, she didn't remember if this whole HFY situation had already been this bad, back when she still lived on the planet, since she had been too young to really be interested in stuff like this back then. But she remembered other cases where Kamal Taperno, who got a bit too influential, was shut down before they could do any major damage. James nodded. There are, both systematic and societal, he confirmed her statement, while rubbing his nape with his artificial hand. However, he managed to circumvent them by going for a rather unusual route, while also employing the help of outside interference. Though again, no idea if I'm correct, but Admir at least seems to believe it's plausible. Figures after he was the one who actually pushed me in this direction. Sheila smacked her lips at him, as he was clearly stalling for time, although she had to let her head sink down once again as the strain on her neck got too much for her to hold it up any longer. Andrej also loudly cleared his throat to encourage James to carry on without them having to try and cut every bit of information out of him. We're all ears, he said expectantly. James now fully sat up, pulling Sheila's legs that still lay on his along as he scooted back to bring his back flat up against the backrest. Okay, no idea if this actually has a name, but it's kind of a reverse pump and dump in a way, he explained, lifting both hands to gesticulate as he spoke, trying to emphasize anything he said with a corresponding hand gesture, because it turns out that a while ago, there actually were normal trade deals going on. Food was coming in regularly, both produced and imported by all kinds of comaltopeno, so there was a pretty even spread on the market. Then enter Quafwem, who just starts flooding the market. I'm talking serious amounts, going far above demand, and the prices just plummet. Here's the interesting part. Around the same time, prices for the import of comestibles seem to also dramatically lower, causing most people in the business to shift their models towards the imports and away from producing themselves, giving Quafwem a bigger and bigger share of the planet-bound food market. And, if I understand all this correctly, with the way Dunamir's anti-monopoly laws are structured, and since Quafwem is doing all this at an obvious loss for himself, he tries to get away with this, because at this point he is hemorrhaging money, and so is everyone who is trying to compete with him. And he must have had some serious funds behind him, because he kept on doing it, even pumping up his production so the market would stay inflated, even as more and more players dropped out of the food game, or shifted entirely to the much cheaper import variant, instead of producing it themselves. A general air of understanding spread throughout the cabin, as Sam and Andres began to nod, while Sheeta chuffed in a mixture of disdain and, admittedly, amazement. It was by no means a very complicated plan, and Sheeta didn't know if she would go as far as Zisha D and call it ingenious. After all, she felt like she could follow his course already with just this information, but the fact that someone had made it work for themselves, that she had to respect in a morbid way. I have a feeling I know where this is going, Andres said, expressing the obvious, but still leaving room for James to finish his explanation. James let out a sigh that clearly released some tension from his body, as he quickly finished up, claiming, "You guessed it." After his market share has been basically too big to fail for a while, all kinds of corporations that previously had trade deals with Dunamir in one way or another suddenly pulled out, leaving a bunch of comaltopeno suddenly high and dry, after they had been making good money off of the cheap import prices for quite some time. The media claimed it had something to do with Deathworlder tensions or something at the time. I didn't entirely get that part, and I feel like it may just have been a cheap excuse anyway. And with all other major players basically being crippled or having left of their own volition, Dunamir suddenly had what was basically a monopoly on the food market on their hand, that they could legally do nothing about due to a technicality in the laws. And with Quafwem Thera quickly becoming the leading comaltopeno, the laws weren't changing anytime soon. Who would want to go against the guy keeping every mouth on the planet fed? Sam ran a hand along her long hair, pushing stray strands of it behind her ear so it wouldn't bother her at the side of her head. "And you're thinking your galactic big shot friends have something to do with that?" she surmised, crossing her arms and tapping the tip of one finger onto her arm repeatedly. "I can't accuse anyone of anything specific," James replied, while lifting his hands in a deflecting gesture of open palms. "But if I was a betting man..." He didn't finish that sentence, but it was quite clear that that was the idea in the end, while also still bringing across the air that he was in no way sure that he wasn't completely off the mark. "But didn't you mention societal precautions against monopolies as well?" Andres chimed in again, his face scrunched up in thought as he rubbed the knuckle of his right index finger under his nose. How did he get off on a technicality there? However, before James could start stalking the corpse again before coming up with a clear answer, Sheeta jumped in for him. "I can explain that," she said, without turning her head to look directly at the Major, but courteously rotating her ear to show she was ready for a reply. "The usual way to bring down comaltopeno who get delusions of grandeur is to starve them out. Believe it or not, despite all our flaws and egos, Miet are good at coming together if it means bringing someone they don't like down. And with corporations, that usually happens by letting our wallets speak. But, hearing what James just explained to us, there was an important question when it comes to that approach. How do you boycott food? The well-off people with their farms might be able to for a while. That's why they have them, after all. But not everyone's well-off these days." Andres sharply sucked in air through his teeth. "Yup, that would make sense," he admitted with a groan, and now also leaned back in his seat to look up at the ceiling. "Ouch." And as you can probably imagine, James now spoke up to bring his part of the topic to a close. Anyone who has since tried to get a foothold in the food market was suddenly met with a serious string of bad luck running on their parade, none of which could be connected to Quafwem Thera, of course. "Makes sense that he'd want to keep the current council around," she'd amused, alternatively lifting her legs before dropping them back down onto James's thighs. "If whoever is covering his back suddenly stopped, this whole deal might break down around him quite soon." Quite risky to base your own success on the success of someone else, Sam reckoned, seemingly taking a sort of personal offence to that part of Craftworm's assumed plan. However, Andre scoffed at that. That council has been in power for 100 years. I would have stayed so if they hadn't messed up big time, he said, with a slightly exaggerated movement of his arm. I don't think anyone expected it to fall apart any time soon. And it might still not, James added, his face having turned very thoughtful, as his features had softened significantly while his lips shifted left to right. After all, Dunamir's support might play a big part in the upcoming election, and that support is going to be hard to gain as long as Craftworm remains such a big player. And removing him from his position is going to be hard as long as his council contacts remain in power. A quite vicious cycle we find ourselves faced with here. Sheeda suddenly found herself clenching her teeth in an, even to her, unexpected bout of fury. Vicious cycle indeed. It seemed that these people had sunk their fangs into a lot more prey than it had seen before. With such a major player on Dunamir under their direct and easy influence, be it mutual or not, they never had to fear the massive Deathworld spreading its influence. And here Sheeda had simply thought her whole life that Miat were just isolationists. Or people didn't want to make much contact with them because of the high-class Deathworlder thing. Turns out that had been the reason, but in a very different way than she previously assumed. Obviously she wasn't the most patriotic of people, but suddenly learning that a big reason for the bad conditions on Dunamir that had coerced her to leave and join what she perceived to be better people was caused by these very people she had moved to join, only to then be treated by them as she had been after making an effort to get out of all of that, it made her angry. And after everything she had learned while staying with the humans, she wasn't quite so sure how to hold that anger in anymore, or if she even should. However, suddenly she was pulled out of her furious thoughts, as a yelp suddenly pierced the quietly humming cabin. "Ouch!" James yelled out, and only as Sheeda shot around to see what had caused his outcry did she realise that she had, in her anger, subconsciously started to curl her legs and feet, to the point that her claws were now forcibly digging into James's leg, as they had started to extend as soon as her feet had found purchase against it. "I'm so sorry," she immediately yelled out, bringing her feet forwards again before swinging them around to rotate into an upright, sitting position, immediately scooting over to James to inspect the damage she had done. Every bit of the anger she had felt just seconds ago evaporated completely from her mind. Luckily, it seemed that she had snapped out of it just in time, and her accidental attack had left only mild puncture wounds behind, even if dark red blood poured out of the tiny openings cut into both his pants and skin like water from a spring. Sheeda's ears started to hang as she stared at the life-giving liquid, memories of the drying fluid encrusting her blood-caked claws after their first encounter filling her mind. "Are you okay?" she asked worriedly, forcing her gaze up to her boyfriend's face. James grimaced slightly, although he managed to keep his expression neutral for the most part while inspecting his leg, putting the punctured pant leg back with long fingers and studying the wounds with inquisitive looks. "Yeah, I'm alright," he said after a pain-sounding, sharp inhale. "But I hope this wasn't what I think it was, or else you're going to have to start wearing gloves in bed." He was already joking about it, and a concerned look of his in her direction made it seem like he was trying to reassure her, despite her turning him into a pincushion just moments earlier. Sheeda was stuck thinking what she could do to help, her mind slowed to a crawl by the whiplash of emotions she had just gone through, as suddenly footsteps got closer from her side, making her look up. She hadn't even noticed Sam getting up earlier, but now the tall woman stood bent over James's leg with a first aid kit she had gotten from somewhere inside the cabin in her hand. Sheeda quickly made room, as the blonde captain crouched down to get a better look at James's wound. "It's nothing, Major," James assured her with a giggle that mostly hid the slight bit of pain behind it. Sam pursed her lips. "Probably," she said slowly, and pulled on the punctured pan leg a bit more, making James briefly wince, "but it's deep enough that we should at least patch this up." The human woman didn't even spare a glance at Sheeda, as she stood up straight again and took a step back, making room for James. Then, in a mixture of amusement and repressed sass, she added, "Never thought I'd ever say this to you, but drop the pants, Buzz." James scoffed and pushed himself to his feet, not even pausing for a second, before he got to work on doing his belt. "Nothing you haven't seen before," he mumbled to himself, while opening the bottom of his pants, giving a quick, cheeky glance to both of his former teammates in the process, before looking over and smiling at Sheeda. Then, without much fanfare, he let go of the damaged fabric, the waistband of his pants dropping down to his ankles in one fell swoop, leaving him to stand in just his long boxers, of which he had to lift one leg slightly to allow Sam full access to the claw marks on his leg, as she kneeled at his side. Shida looked away as Sam got to work cleaning out and patching up the wounds with supplies from the first aid kit, and as her eyes searched for something to focus on, she instead looked over at Andrej, who had remained remarkably quiet during the whole ordeal. As her eyes met with the Major's crimson ones, the man's lips lifted slightly into a soft smile, as he barely lifted both his eyebrows and his shoulders in a, "well, what can you do?" kind of gesture. Once again, even if it had been a long time, she'd have found herself faced with a human's utter uncaringness when inflicted with bodily harm, and this time it was seemingly encouraged by the surrounding primates as well. Just outside her vision, she could hear James suck in sharp breaths, telling a brief burst of pain every now and then, leading to Sam mumbling something in the general human language at him, to which James laughed and replied something to the effect of enduring cuts and enduring stings, which Sheila didn't entirely understand with her limited mastery of the language. Then, as it seemed that James's medical care was just about complete, the door to the cockpit was suddenly opened in a quick motion, with Amir stepping out of it and into the larger cabin, while looking back towards the front of the plane. Sir, we have a bit of a situation here." His voice started to stock, as his head turned towards them and he realized the scene that was unfolding in front of his eyes, with Sam kneeling next to James with his pants down, while Andrej and Shida stood awkwardly by, with Shida most likely having a very guilty and worried look on her face. "But apparently you're having one as well." Andrej's expression instantly changed from the previously well-meaning one into a well-practiced, hardened look of firm seriousness, as his head snapped around to Amir so fast that his long hair flew around, trailing after the motion even after it was completed. "Out with it," he ordered strictly, making it clear that even a very humorous situation was not reason enough to not report whatever had been important enough for Amir to be sent back here to inform everyone else about it. "Right," Amir replied, immediately taking up a bit more of a proper posture and tearing his eyes away from James's exposed legs. "Sir, the city is lit up—" "No, Sir, there seems to be an unusual amount of activity in the city." Shida furrowed her brow. It had already started to get dark when they had left the frigid south. Even considering time zone changes, it should be pretty late at night right now, and the city should be empty. "The city is lit up?" Andrej picked up on Amir's first, half-discarded report with a raised eyebrow. "Like a Christmas tree, sir," Amir replied with a nod. Seeing as none of them had literally anything better to do, nor had they a reason not to, everyone currently in the cabin started to move towards the cockpit, where they could apparently get a view of what was happening themselves, although James did pull his pants up again before stepping any closer to both their pilot and Tuya, who were still sitting in the cockpit. Shida's eyes weren't nearly as good as the humans', so her image of the situation lacked a good amount of detail, but even she could see what Admir had been talking about. Where the city should have laid nicely quiet, dark and calm for the night, it was instead a sea of light, illuminating the nightly darkness like a particularly obnoxious brothel looking for business. Luckily, the steadiness of the light sources, as well as the lack of any rising plumes of dark smoke, indicated that the city was at least not burning to the ground as they observed, but if one knew Dunamur, it was still a rather disconcerting sight. "Do we have any idea of what is happening down there?" Andrej, now a lot more serious than he had been before, asked their pilot for an update. The pilot nodded. "Positive, sir," he said. "Apparently people from the cramps are letting off some steam. It seems that the shortages have hit this area especially hard recently, and those fine people down there aren't exactly happy about it." Shida swallowed heavily, and next to her, she could see James darkly grimace. "Are our people down there okay?" Andrej asked, the worry he was most likely feeling not seeping through into his voice. "Positive, sir," the pilot replied. "The hotel seems to be safe for the time being. Seems like the rioters aren't looking for a fight. They're just going after empty buildings, at least for the time being." "I'm still not sure it would be a good idea for us to try and get through all of that mess." Tuya made her thoughts known even while her dark eyes remained fixated on the lights below, as she swiped the long part of her green hair back behind her ear. "Agreed," Andrej confirmed. "Do we have a status from the port?" The pilot took a slow breath, letting it out loudly through his nose. "They say it's safe to touch down. The landing area is free," he informed in a professional tone. "However, whatever happens after we leave, well..." Everyone looked back at the Major, who brought his hand to his chin in thought. "Suddenly, I'm glad the cities are generally empty at night," Shida heard James mumble behind her, while his superior quietly thought about how to proceed. Finally, the Major shook his head. "I don't like this," he stated soberly. "What is the closest port we can fall back on instead?" "Nyiteka," The pilot answered immediately. I already suspected that might be an option, so I contacted them, and they're willing to let us land. No idea if we can find a place to stay at this hour, though. Sheeta's ears twitched as she heard the name of their possible next destination, and she felt James's gaze on her, as he had apparently recognized it as well. If she was being honest, she hadn't planned on returning to her old prowling grounds during this visit to the planet, and she didn't know how comfortable she was with possibly being forced to do it now. But, under these circumstances, she certainly would be making an objection. Even if the Rioters weren't actively looking for a fight, she certainly didn't want to try and peacefully get through whatever they were doing down there. We'll have to take it, Andres said, apparently already planning on how they would proceed once they arrived. We'll sleep in the shuttle if we have to. Tell everybody back at base to stay safe. We'll be back in the morning. Roger, the pilot replied, and got to work transmitting the message. Meanwhile, James growled, and I'll have a Veselon's head if anything happens to them. Marking manipulation or not, this goes too far. They'll have to stop this before the consequences aren't retrievable anymore. Sheeta nodded and took a step back to press herself up against him. He was right. As angry as she was about Kwafwem and the people he was most likely working with, she was angry at them, not at all those people down there. She too wanted to see him bleed out, but not at all costs. With the plan solidified, the shuttle took a turn and started heading towards its new destination, arriving at the, luckily dark and quiet, city of Nyanteka only shortly after. Simply based on the architecture of the surrounding buildings, it would have been hard to tell this city's space would depart from that of any other city, had Sheeta not known fully well where she was. She knew these buildings. They were the last thing she had seen before leaving Dunamur for what she thought was for good. Still, the humans had little eyes for the architecture tonight, as they hurried to get themselves processed in the barely active insides of the port, quickly getting identifications and check-ins over with. Unanimously, they decided to at least check and look around if they could find fitting accommodations for the night, before they would resort to sleeping in the shuttle. However, a quick check in the net revealed that at least anything with an open web page did not accept any unappointed new arrivals at this hour. Sheeta had honestly expected as much. However, there's still some stuff we could try, depending on how much we're willing to spend. Not sure if you'll be very happy with it, though, she informed everyone as their, now more than ever, local guide. Funds weren't a problem, and most of the group were used to just being able to sleep wherever, so the luxury of their abode wasn't exactly a problem either. Still, the option she had in mind was a little more precarious. As a group, they left the spaceport, immediately spreading themselves out a bit as they obviously had the entire street to themselves, leaving James and Sheeta to walk tightly together in the middle of a pretty wide circle of people. By now, the humans had obviously already pulled on their breath filters again, although James had made use of his special permissions and elected to keep it off, figuring that after he had to identify himself at the port, any secret that might have been still hidden had long been lifted at this point. And now that things were getting a bit calmer again, earlier events came to mind once more. James, about earlier, Sheeta started. However, James didn't let her get very far with her attempt at an apology. Don't worry about it, he said quickly, and put an arm around her shoulders, pulling her in tighter. You know I've been through much worse, but, are you okay? You seemed rather tense there. Had he really just turned this around on her? He looked down at her with a sincerely worried expression, his lips curling down into a mild frown while he tried to keep a neutral look in his face. I'm fine, she replied with a sigh, thinking about how to explain herself. I'm fine, it's just I got overwhelmed for a second there. What happened again? James lifted an eyebrow. Do I actually have to put gloves on you tonight? He asked, his voice rising in a mild attempt at humour, and Sheeta narrowed her eyes up at his face while wiggling with her ears suggestively. Just try it, she challenged him. See where it gets you. And suddenly, like an electric current through her body, she was once again aware that she had been fighting with the intense effects of her heat not too long ago. And now she had accidentally poked the hornet's nest. Great. Immediately she pushed herself away from James, twirling out of the arm he had lovingly wrapped around her. Nope, she exclaimed. Can't do this right now. James was left sniggering but pulled his arm back. It got so far that Sheeta even had to avoid looking at him for a second just to get her mind in order. She was determined to not let herself be dragged around by her instincts like some hormonal teen. It's really bad for you, huh? James asked sympathetically, his laughter dying down as he watched her struggle with herself. It's worse, Sheeta exclaimed with a groan, right before her ears suddenly twitched, as an unfitting sound for such a quiet night suddenly crept into her hearing. Knowing fully well where it would lead her, she added, "And speaking of it, that is also going to be worse." Everyone looked at her confusedly, mostly because the human's much worse hearing likely didn't pick up on the obnoxiously bumping music yet. However, soon enough, they also became aware of it, as well as of the fact that they were actively closing in on it. And, not long after, they stood in front of the place Sheeta had been leading them towards. Somehow it was reassuring in a way that it was still here, even after all these years. A mostly typical building for the area. Flowing architecture, low ceilings, 3 levels. A pretty usual sight if it wasn't for the, despite the hour, still brightly shining lights and the obnoxious music coming from the inside, as well as the many colourful little flags hung up invitingly all around the entrance. Everyone looked at the building with a mixture of curiosity and very apparent confusion, except for Sam, who seemed to be almost entirely frozen in place at the sight. "Wait, that is," she started, and she didn't even let her finish. "Yep," she replied, and took a deep, calming breath. "It's the month of months, so business is probably going to be slow since people don't have trouble finding a girl right now. Still, I hope some of you don't mind sharing a room. They'll probably not have enough for all of us to get one for themselves." Sam looked around, scanning everyone's faces carefully with clear apprehension of her own. "We're not seriously going to sleep in there tonight, are we?" she asked, masking no attempts to hide her dislike of that idea. "It's the best thing we're going to get at an hour like this," Sheeta replied with a wide shrug. "And as long as you ask them to change the bedsheets beforehand, it's not all that difficult from a hotel." Andrej, who seemed more incredulous towards the idea than straight up adverse, lifted an eyebrow. "And they'll just let us get away with that without, indulging in any of their..." He paused for a second to clear his throat in an attempt to drown out a less tasteful remark he wanted to make, instead replacing it with services. Sheeta loudly yawned, exposing her fangs to the night air. "As long as we pay, they don't care if we screw them, tell them our life story, or send them home for an early end to their workday. So if you want to get some service, I'm not going to stop you, but you really don't have to," she replied, feeling the tiredness creeping up in her more and more now that the place to rest was technically in sight. "So are we going in or not?" The humans exchanged some looks with each other, and generally shrugged as an expression of their personal opinions. That was except for James, whose eyes seemed to be glued to something next to the doorframe. Following his gaze, she just saw a territorial carving embedded into the wall right next to the entrance. It was the hand-embalming claw marks, the sign of the Zishidi Coatopeno that they had gone to admire very big and prominent a few hours ago. So, they owned this place too. Made sense for someone who generally dealt in pleasure and comfort. After all, they sold the stuff that allowed people to use places like these without further consequences. "You okay?" she asked, tapping against James's arm to gain his attention. "Yeah," James replied. And as it seemed that nobody had a sensible reason not to take this opportunity, they entered the building altogether. Obviously, the strange group immediately pulled the attention of every girl currently working on the ground level onto itself as soon as they came through the door, ears and eyes of all colours and sizes turning towards them with curious gazes. Sheeta used that opportunity and raised her hand before loudly announcing, "Ladies, we need rooms. Who's ready to get off early tonight?"